In Genesis chapter 30, after Jacob has worked the 7 years for one wife and 7 years for the other wife, after he's worked those 14 years, he goes to Laban, and what's his request? What does he ask of Laban? What does Jacob ask Laban? So let me go back home. Let me take my wives and my children, in chapter 30, verse 26, and let me go back home. And what was Laban's response? Yeah, stick around. I basically said, I've realized that you're really good for me, that you're good for business. And so name your wages, and I'll give it to you because I've figured out that you're good for business. And what's Jacob's response? How does he respond to that? Okay, I'm going to take these certain kinds of sheep from the flock, and they'll be easy to identify if I've taken any of yours just because of their genetics, and I'll just take that as my wages. And so he continued working. In chapter 31, though, where we pick up tonight, Jacob overhears Laban's sons, his brothers-in-law, talking about that Jacob has taken away everything that belonged to their father and made it his wealth. And then Jacob also looks at Laban's attitude, and what does he see in Laban's attitude? It's not as friendly as it was before either. When he first started this, Laban encouraged him to stay there, wanted him to stay behind, and said, whatever your wages are, I'll pay them. But Laban's attitude's not quite so positive anymore, and the brothers-in-law are complaining. Now, there are a couple of problems with that attitude. One of them is kind of like the workers that were hired first thing in the morning and then later on in the day. The only ones who had agreed for a price were the ones who were complaining. All Jacob was doing was exactly what they agreed to. He wasn't doing any more or less than what the agreement was to begin with. And second, in spite of Jacob's attempts to try to influence the outcome of the mating, really, who determined what Jacob got? God did. God was in charge of what Jacob got. And so Jacob was not stealing anything from Laban. He was just working according to the original agreement. It wasn't his fault if God was making it work in his favor. So what does Jacob decide to do about it? He's going to leave. Now, how is he being treated by Laban? Poorly. How do the daughters see their treatment? If you get down to verses like 14, 15, and 16, how do Rachel and Leah feel about their treatment? They want to go because we're treated like foreigners. He's consumed our purchase price. You see, he worked 7 years for one and 7 years for the other. He got 14 years of free labor, and they say he's consumed all of that. And anything that's been taken by God and given to you is ours and our children's anyway. And so they don't feel they're being treated well. Jacob is not being treated well, and so they all agree. In verse 7, Jacob says that your father has cheated me and changed my wages 10 times, but God is the one who didn't let it happen. God is the one that took control. And he just explains how God gave him everything he had.
So up there in verse 2 where it says that Laban wasn't friendly to him anymore, was he actually friendly at all?
Well, he seemed friendly because he knew he was good for business. When after the 14 years, when he said, "Oh, please stay," I'll give you whatever you want, whatever salary you want, that at least was on the surface friendly. It was kind of a friendly relationship, although it was friendly because it was beneficial for Laban. And so,
What's funny is that
Yeah, well, there was something, even though they were separated, still he was gaining from Laban's flock, even in spite of that those genes had been separated out. And so God was probably capitalizing on that very fact to end up giving him what he gave him. And so Jacob decides he's going to have to pack up and leave.
I read somewhere, I read a commentary about that whenever Jacob made this, Jacob made this agreement about Jacob said, whichever ones had spotted and all this from CCLI, that they had something about 3 days distance between them, that Laban took and hid those ones that flocks that Jacob didn't have those. So he was deceptive that way.
Yeah, there could be some deception in that separation of the flocks that his shepherds were trying to keep things away from him. The bottom line was God was the one who determined what Jacob ended up getting. And although Laban's intention was to cheat Jacob, it worked out the opposite.
Laban, he proved that from the beginning. With his deception with Leah, he proved that from the beginning that he wasn't trustworthy.
Yeah, already from the beginning, he was dishonest about the wages because the deal was that Jacob would work for 7 years in exchange for Rachel, and by changing that, he was already demonstrating that he was being dishonest with the wages. And then Jacob was willing to work another 7 years for her, and then he's worked another 6 years for the flocks. But things are just deteriorating, and he realizes he just needs to get out of there.
Right in verse 34 there. And as soon as they agreed on it, Laban tried to take all the ones that might be spotted
And move them, kind of hide them.
Try to cheat on the deal, right?
Yeah. You're going to get these, so I'm going to go hide them somewhere so you don't get all of them. Now, the real key, though, there is along about verse 11 of chapter 31, where it's God who is communicating with Jacob and telling him what he needs to do and what he's given him the animals. And in verse 13, the angel, God tells him to leave this land and return to the land of your birth. And so that's probably the motivation he needs to make the change. Laban is not happy, and so he crosses Jacob has crossed the Euphrates, and Laban goes chasing after him. And it takes about 7 days to catch up, and he catches up with him. Now, that night before they get together, what happens to Laban in his dream? God appears to Laban in a dream, and what does he say? Do not speak good or bad. In other words, you just be quiet. You don't say anything to upset Jacob. Don't say anything good. Don't say anything bad. You have no say in it. What God is saying, you have no say in what Jacob is doing. So just keep your mouth shut. But Laban gets there and he says, why have you deceived me this way? And we kind of get back to the deceiver here. And, Laban goes into all this problem of why Jacob's doing something wrong. Then in verse 29 he said, I could do you harm, but God said, don't do that. But in verse 30, what does Laban complain about? Why did you steal my gods? I mean, you took my daughters, you took my grandchildren, you took my flocks, which none of that was true. But why did you take my gods? And unfortunately, that was the only thing he said that was true. Because what had happened? Rachel had taken the household idol, or idols, and carried them off. But she was able to successfully hide them so that Laban couldn't find them. And so Jacob is really upset now because he doesn't know about it. And Jacob tells Laban, well, you've searched through all my stuff. Where is what you're accusing me of? Where are the idols that you're accusing me of stealing? And he says in verse 38, I've worked for you for 20 years. I haven't taken any of yours. If there was anything that was torn by beasts or any kind of a loss, I took it myself. If it was stolen, no matter what happened, I took care of the loss. And for 20 years, I've worked hard, and still, in verse 42, if it would not have been for God, then you would have sent me away empty-handed. You would have sent me away without my wives or my children or my flocks or anything, and that's the way you would have sent me away. I think in verse 43, Laban's risking violating what God told him to do or not do. He's getting pretty close. He said, the daughters are my daughters, and the children are my children, and the flocks are my flocks, and all that you see is mine. Now, is that true? Jacob's worked for him for 20 years, and always the agreement was that what he had was his. It was not Laban's, it was his. When you give your daughters in marriage, they go to the husbands. And so what he's saying is simply not true. But they decide to make a covenant, and Laban gives it an Aramaic name, means a heap of witness, and Jacob calls it Gilead, which is Hebrew for the same thing. But then Jacob also calls it Mizpah, and Mizpah is watchtower, and it means may God watch between you and me while we're apart. It's interesting in verse 53 of chapter 31. Who does Jacob call as witness? It depends on your translation of how you read this, because in the New American Standard it reads that he's talking about one God because it always capitalizes the G. And so he says the God of Abraham and the God of Nahor, implying that it's the same God. The God of their father judge between us. And so if you read it that way, Abraham and his brother and his father all worship the same God. Or in other translations, that second God may not be capitalized, which means that he's making a distinction between the God of Abraham and the God of Nahor. And basically, he's saying, choose whichever one, either the real God or the false God that you people have been following. But he swears by the fear of his father Isaac, and that's God, that's Jehovah. And that's the one that he takes the oath by. In chapter 12, Jacob heads back to his homeland. 32. It's kind of like a 12, but it has a 3 instead of a 1. And so he heads back home, and he sees Esau headed toward them with 400 men. So what's going on in his mind? Oops. When he left, what was Esau's attitude? You're a dead man. I'm going to kill you. That's the reason he left in the first place. And 20 years later, here comes his brother with 300 or 400 men, and his thought is, I'm dead. And so he started dividing things up to maybe protect some of them. And in verse 9, he kind of calls God, oh, by the way, do you remember what you said? Do you remember the promise? Do you remember when you said, come back to this country and that you will make me prosper? He said, I'm not worthy of the things that you've done for me, because when I went across the Jordan, I had nothing. And remember, he talked to God about if you'll just give me basically the essentials, the clothes on my back and my other needs. I went over with nothing, and now I'm coming back with this huge bunch of stuff. And so, because he split them up, he's divided up his. I don't know what the word actually means, but here I am with 2 big bunches of stuff, like 2 big flocks or 2 big groups. And he starts setting aside a present to send ahead of him to give to Esau, and sends them in the hands of his servants. And he says, when you meet my brother, and he says, who do they belong to? You say that they're his, that Jacob, they belong to Jacob, but they're present to you. And so he sent them in droves, figuring, okay, maybe the first one will satisfy them, and if he doesn't take that, maybe the second one will satisfy him, and maybe the third will satisfy him. And maybe by the time he gets to me, he'll be okay.
So does his worry that Esau will kill him and all his family, his prayer to God, does that show lack of faith?
Yeah, because it's a very natural lack of faith that we often exhibit ourselves, that we pray to God and turn something over to God, and then we worry about it ourselves. And he's turning it over to God, and then he's going to try to handle it. And sometimes that's okay. I mean, God works through whatever we do. God doesn't expect us to sit back and twiddle our thumbs. But I think you may be right that that indicates a little bit too much concern on his part, that he's not quite to where Abraham is, where Abraham has the knife raised up, and he doesn't know what's going to happen, but he knows that it will happen. And I don't know if Jacob's quite reached that point yet. I think he's still maturing.
It was a pretty smart move to send all of his gifts ahead of him, because the thing that he was mad about was that he didn't get his share of the blessings of the prophets.
Yeah. Yeah, Jacob had ripped off all of his stuff. And so he thought maybe by giving him some stuff, maybe he won't be so angry when he gets down to me. And it's really my fault anyway, because I was really the conniver. But maybe if he gets his stuff, then maybe he'll be okay with it. And so Jacob sends even his children ahead. And by the way, verse 22 says 11 children, but at this time he has 12 children, 11 sons and a daughter. But that word children probably means sons, because they were the ones who would fit into the promise. And so it's probably not counting Dinah, but he actually had 12 children. And then a very, I don't know if you call it interesting or strange event takes place. And what happens? He's left alone, and a man wrestles with him until daybreak. And so, what kind of a man is this? That's a good question, but I ask it first.
Well, then he had the Jacob ends up a real physical, dislocated.
Yeah, and as it doesn't take very long before Jacob figures out who this is, but there's something to be said for reading the whole Bible and using the Bible to explain the Bible. If you go to Hosea chapter 12, where you would least expect it, in Hosea chapter 12, verses 3 and 4. In verse 3 it says, "In the womb he took his brother by the heel, and in his maturity he contended with God. Yes, he wrestled with the angel and prevailed, and wept and sought his favor, and found him at Bethel." And so Hosea identifies this as God or as an angel. And so must be true. And so this was an angel that was wrestling Jacob, but it is an angel who has accepted a much inferior role, because one angel can wipe out 185,000 trained armed soldiers. And so he's wrestling with more than one hand tied behind his back. This is an angel, but who has put himself in a position where it's going to be a more fair fight, because you just don't wrestle angels and come out ahead. It's just doesn't happen.
I think it's a great, not metaphor, but just visual of what it is to wrestle with God, because God can totally wipe out any fret we had,
Yeah, and I think you're absolutely right. That this is symbolic. There's more. The physical wrestling thing is really not the point. The point is what's the message is trying to be given, and there is a physical struggle here, but there's also a mental and spiritual struggle. It gets down to almost a war of words. Who are you and who are you and that kind of a thing.
And I think you can really see that in Hebrews 12 when it refers back to Jacob and it says, Jacob leaned on his staff. It's reminding you that this hip was dislocated because he wrestled with God. But, I think that was the transformed, like when his faith was really transformed.
Yeah. And I think that he has been wrestling with God for all this time. And he prevails, but I don't think in the sense that he has defeated God. I think he's prevailed in his struggle with God. And he's not stronger than God, and he's not stronger than the angel. I think he's prevailed in the goal of getting to know the God that he's dealing with.
Well, it's the struggle, it's the spiritual struggle that we hear that in the news. Our struggle isn't with flesh and blood, but see, he's been, like you said, he's already been struggling. He's been wrestling because of the situation with Laban. He wants to do what's right in God's eyes, and Laban's creating the situation for him.
And this is primarily a spiritual struggle, and there's great symbolism in the names, because the angel says, "What is your name?" And he says, "My name is Jacob." You remember what Jacob means? Supplanter, one who grabs by the heel. And why was he called that? That's what he did when they were born. He grabbed his brother by the heel. Do you know what Israel means? God prevails. And so it's from Jacob was the one who grabbed a hold and prevailed, to God is the one who prevails. And so in this encounter, his name is changed from someone who is a supplanter, someone who prevails by grabbing somebody by the heel, to God prevails. God God strives. And so I think it's in the symbolism of the name change that we see the meaning of the struggle, that he comes to the understanding that God is the one who prevails, and that he prevails in God and through God. In chapter 33, he encounters Esau heading his way with the 400 men, and so he starts dividing up his children. And here you see a little bit more of that favoritism, and we've seen that favoritism pop up quite a bit. And how is that favoritism obvious here? How they're lined up. How does he arrange them to go meet somebody he thinks might kill them? Okay, the maids and their children go out first, and then Leah and her children go out first, and then second, and then finally Rachel and Joseph, and they go out next. And Esau's puzzled. He said, what is all of this? And Jacob said, "I want to find favor in your sight." And what's Esau's response? "I'm fine, I have plenty." He's mellowed a little bit in 20 years. 20 years ago, he had nothing because Jacob had stolen it all. The problem was Jacob had to leave town with nothing. And so what did it gain Jacob? He got nothing out of the deal. And so Esau has done fine. And he said, I don't need anything. Keep what you have. And there's this exchange. Jacob says, "Oh no, I'm just so happy to see you. It's like seeing the face of God, to see your face again, and that you've accepted me." And so they barter for this gift. And Esau wants them to travel together, but Jacob says, "No. The children are frail, the flocks are frail. Let us just go on at our own pace." And I don't think he wants to get together with Esau for a long long-term commitment here. He doesn't want to push his luck, and so he's saying, things are great. You go back home, and I'll go home, and we'll all be okay.
I think this is a really important story, though, because, we talked about in our other class, not with you, but about Romans 8, and people using the fact that, God loved Jacob but hated Esau. And it's really important to point out that God blessed Esau. He just didn't choose Esau
Yeah.
to continue the following generations. And I think this is, this really shows it. That he didn't hate Esau in terms of.
And it was a comparative type thing, yeah. And what he hated was Esau's choices and Esau's disrespect for his birthright and his blessing. But we do see the benefit of Isaac's blessing. He couldn't bless Esau except that he would eventually break the yoke and be okay on his own. But he couldn't give him superiority over Jacob because he had already given Jacob superiority over him. But Esau was still able to do okay. Jacob eventually goes to Shechem in chapter 33, and he bought a piece of land there. And he built an altar there. Go back to Genesis chapter 12 and verse 6. Abram's been called out of Haran to the promised land, and as he and Sarah and Lot get into the promised land, where's the first location that they stop? They stop in Shechem, and what does Abram do? He builds an altar to the God who had appeared to him. And so Abram gets to the promised land, and he gets to Shechem, and he builds an altar to the God who had appeared to him. When Israel returns to the promised land after being gone, where does he stop? He stops in Shechem. And what's the one thing that he does? He builds an altar. And so the God who had been with him and helped him and called him back to this land, it's just kind of a full circle. This is where Abram started, and this is where Isaac comes back. Chapter 34 is one of those asides. There are a lot of little stories that are kind of not part of the regular flow, but they figure later in. But Shechem, the man named Shechem, is the son of the leader of this area. And he falls in love with Dinah, the one daughter, and forces her to sleep with him. And he says to his father, I want you to get her to be my wife. And so they set about doing that. Jacob's sons, Israel's sons, are just not real happy about the way their sister's been treated because of the way that she's been abused. And so they make a deal with the people. They said, okay, we'll let her marry him if all of the males will be circumcised, because you have to be circumcised. But it's really not an honest deal. Now, neither side is being honest, because what discussion's going on among the people of Shechem, the father and the son and the people? Yeah, they're going to be good for the land, and basically we're going to get everything they have. We're going to end up with all their stuff if they'll just come be part of us, and it's going to be good for business. The brothers are not being too honest in the whole deal either, because their whole point is that on the 8th day when nobody's able to move, they're going to come in and wipe them all out, which is exactly what they did. They came in and slaughtered them, which did not make Judah, Israel, very happy, because that made him kind of not well liked by the people of the land. You know, here you move into a town, then you kill all the people. And so the people in other cities are not going to look on that real favorably. You know, you move into McPherson, you kill all the people in McPherson. The people in Hutch aren't going to think very much of you for wiping out all of McPherson. But basically the son said, well, we had to because of the way they treated our sister. Chapter 35 picks up again with Jacob.
I think that is just hysterical. You know, he brings them out and says, you didn't go them, yes, we did. Yeah, well, maybe she should do such.
Yeah, and
It was meant.
yeah, it just,
He didn't change their mind.
no, he just, it's kind of like he said, okay. In chapter 35, God calls Jacob to go to Bethel and make an altar. That's where he started out when he fled from Esau. And so as he's going there in chapter 35, verse 2, what does he tell the people to do? Put away the foreign gods which are among you. Now, we've already seen, what did Rachel do? She stole Laban's gods, his household gods. And Jacob has everybody with him put away the foreign gods. And that was the end of the foreign gods. They got rid of them, and there were no more foreign gods after that. Joshua chapter 24. As Joshua is toward the end of his life, Moses leads the people. Joshua leads the people. And at the end of Joshua's life, in Joshua 24 and verse 23, what does Joshua tell the people of Israel that he's speaking to? Put away the foreign gods that are in your midst and incline your hearts to God, the God of Israel. And so they do that, and there are never any more foreign gods in all of Israel, except in Judges chapter 10. And God has put the Israelites into oppression, and they cry out to God, and God says something that he should have said more often. And in Judges 10:14, what does God tell the people? You like those other gods so much, go complain to them. They'll take care of you. Just go cry to them. And they said, oh no. And so in verse 16, what are they told to do? Put away the foreign gods and serve the Lord. And so they got rid of all of the foreign gods, and they never had any foreign gods again. In 2 Kings chapter 18, and I'm sure we're skipping a lot of gods in there because they just did. For example, when David's wife Micah was making it look like he was still in bed, what did she use to make it look like he was still in bed? The household idol. David's wife had a household idol in the bedroom. 2 Kings 18, when Hezekiah becomes king, what does he have to do in 2 Kings 18, verse 4? He has to go wipe out all the idols, get rid of all the idols. And so they get rid of all the idols, and there are not any more idols evermore in the land of Israel till chapter 21. 21 verse 3, Manasseh becomes king. Hezekiah's son Manasseh becomes king in 2 Kings 21:3, and what does he do? He brings them all back again. And then eventually Josiah becomes king, and in 2 Kings 23, all the way from verse 4 and following, what does Josiah have to do? Get rid of all those idols. So what happens throughout the whole history from the time of Abram, because they are to get rid of the gods that you serve beyond the river. From the time of Abram down through the time when the divided kingdom is over and Judah is finally overrun, the Israelites are spending a lot of time worshiping idols. Building idols, replacing idols, and they get rid of them and they get them back. And since we don't have any idols in our lives today, then it doesn't really apply to us. What are the idols in our life today? Greed, covetousness, power, fame. Anything that we worship is an idol. Is there ever the temptation on our part after we've gotten rid of something to bring it back in? To let it find its way back in? If we don't replace it with, if you kick it out and don't replace it with something good, it's going to come back with 7 others. And so the history of Israel is one of idolatry. And they keep having to get rid of the idols. And we just want to make sure that the same thing's not true in our lives, that our life is not a history of having to get the idols out of our life because we brought them back in again. Because it's not a good history on the part of Israel. And so Jacob says, okay, get rid of all the idols, the foreign gods, and purify you. And we'll go up to Bethel, and I'll build an altar. And so they gave Jacob all the foreign gods and their rings in their ears. I'm not quite sure what Jacob did with them, because instead of destroying them, he just buried them. And I wonder if that's what we do with some of our idols sometimes too. Instead of eliminating them, I wonder if we just kind of bury them in the backyard and we remember where it was we put them, and so we can find them again. He came to what would become Bethel and built an altar. And what does Bethel mean? House of God. Beth is house. El is the name for God. And so Bethel is the house of God. And that's where God had revealed himself to him as he was fleeing from his brother. And then in chapter 35, God repeats what the angel had said. When Jacob was wrestling with the angel, and the angel said, you're not going to be Jacob anymore, you're going to be Israel. That was confirmed, ratified here in chapter 35, because God appears to Jacob again and blesses him. And what does God say to Jacob? Your name is no longer Jacob, but Israel will be your name. And so he called him Israel. God identifies himself as El Shaddai, God Almighty. And he repeats 2 of the promises. What are the 3 promises that God makes to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob in different places? Your descendants will be as numerous as the sand of the sea and the stars in the skies. You will possess this land, and in your seed all nations will be blessed. And 2 of those are here evident in this promise. Unless at the end of verse 11 where it says, and kings shall come forth from you, where he's also indicating that the king, not only David and Solomon and those kings will come from you, but the king will eventually come to you, which would be the Messiah. As they traveled on from Bethel, Rachel goes into labor and suffers severe labor. And just as the son was being born, she died. And what did she name her second son? Ben-Oni. And what does Ben-Oni mean? The God of my trouble, the God of my sorrow. And so that's what she was going to name him, but his father, Israel, named him the son of my right hand. And so instead of the son of my sorrow, named him the son of my right hand. And so Rachel died, and they set up a pillar there. And he continued to travel around. And at the end of chapter 35, we go back to Isaac. Isaac is still alive through all of this, through all of Jacob's time with Laban and this reunion and everything. Isaac is still living. But how old does Isaac live to be? 180 years old. And he breathes his last and died, and is gathered to his people. An old man of ripe age, and his sons buried him. It was a much more pleasant funeral than they had expected, because originally the funeral was going to be the day that Jacob died. As soon as the father was dead, then Jacob was going to be dead. That was Esau's plan. But instead, over the years, it was where the brothers came together and buried their father together.
I think Jacob and Esau were 120 years.
What's that?
Jacob and Esau were 120 because Isaac was 60 when they were born.
Okay, so they're getting on up there too, 120 years old. They're just spring chickens by now. You later on when you get to Jacob in Egypt when he dies, he says, "I'm dying kind of young. I'm not like my forefathers who lived to be old guys." What was he, 120? Is that how old Jacob was when he died? Somewhere in there, 147. And so he didn't make it to 180. He didn't get to be nearly as old as his parents did. His father did, at least. Chapter 36 is just the records of the generations of Esau. Remember, that's that statement that's repeated over and over in the book of Genesis, the records of the generations of so-and-so. And it's just a lengthy account of Esau's descendants.
One important development there is Anna was Oholibam's mama.
Oh, yeah, Oholibama's mama. In verse 2. Yeah, Anna was Oholibama's mama. Say that 3 times real fast. Oholibama's mama. I think the main thing is who Esau became. Esau's nation would be called what? Edom. And so that's probably the key thing, is that whenever we read about the Edomites, we're talking about the descendants of Esau. But, in spite of the blessing that was taken from him, and the blessing went to Jacob, Esau didn't get too bad a deal, did he? If you look at his line and his descendants, then he didn't get too bad a deal. I think we've answered all those important questions at the bottom of your sheet. But why do you think Laban had a household idol?
He certainly didn't trust God.
He didn't trust God. And he should have had the family history, somewhere in the family history, to have some connection with God. His grandfather came out of Ur of the Chaldees with his great-grandfather, or at least his great-grandfather came out with Abram and Lot. And so there was, at least through Abram, some kind of a connection with the real God. But he didn't choose to follow God. Shouldn't he have seen in Jacob's life? Didn't he recognize that Jacob was being blessed, and that he was blessed whenever he was associated with Jacob?
So instead, he just accused him of stealing.
What's that?
Instead, he accused him of stealing.
Yeah, he accused him of stealing, but logically, he had to have seen that God was blessing Jacob and blessing him through Jacob.
I don't think at that point in Jacob's life, Jacob was very I know he believed in God and was faithful. I just don't think that he was I think it was still kind of his dad's faith. And I think, he made that bargain with God at Bethel.
Yeah.
And he was like, you do this for me and I'll do it, And so, and then when God came back to him, it said in that verse, I'm God, the God of Bethel, or whatever like that. So he reminded
Yeah, no,
it's
it,
gonna be.
his faith was a growing
Yeah.
process, but Laban had to see there was something special going on, and you know that Jacob was saying that I didn't take anything from your father really, I only have what God gave me. But I think because of the things that happened, he's still in a learning process, and that may culminate with the wrestling with the angel to finally reach some maturity in his faith.
I think for people who are unwilling to see God too, it's hard to see God working in other people's lives.
Yeah,
You know,
and I think that may be what was Laban's problem was he didn't see God working in Jacob because he wasn't wired that way. What things did Laban notice? Bling. He noticed gold. He noticed, and even when he was benefiting from Jacob taking care of his flocks, he probably didn't get back to the real root cause of it. He was just impressed by the fact he was getting stuff. And so I think that he was probably blinded by materialism. And there's a lesson for us, too, that God can be working all around us, but we don't see it. Because we're blinded by materialism, and we're blinded by the priorities of this world, and we don't really evaluate what God is doing in our lives or the lives of other people.
I think we also think that, like, if God, well, not us, but just we as people, as mankind, think that if God isn't going to give us something, then we can turn to a different idol or a different, like, means to get what we want. And I kind of think that's what Laban was doing too. I think it was kind of like, well, I don't know if you really exist, but I'm going to pray to you. He was like the unknown God.
Yeah.
The idols were. I don't really know what impact you have on my life, but if praying to you could possibly help me in the future.
Yeah, and I don't even know that Laban was praying much to God. I mean, he was more concerned about his household idol, and he's kind of like the Jewish leaders in Jesus' day. Here, Jesus is having a conversation with their thoughts, not with what they're saying. They don't get it. Who had just spoken to Laban the night before? God had spoken to Laban in person, and I don't know that Laban still got it. And so, you know, the story of the rich man and Lazarus, what does the rich man want Abraham to send Lazarus back to do? He wants somebody to go back and warn his brothers who are still listening and are still living, I mean. And what does God tell, or what does Abraham tell the rich man? They have the law and the prophets. They have God's word. If they don't believe that, they're not going to get it. And so if we're looking in the wrong places, we're not going to get it. And so even God can speak to Laban in person, and Laban doesn't get it because he's materialistic.
You know, if someone's behavior is to be manipulative and hateful, no matter what you do, then you still do the right thing and let them be.
Yeah.
Let them be.
And that's all you can do is just do your part.
God will take care
And
of all of us.
they'll either get it or not get it. Okay, thank you very much. Next week we will continue our saga, switching